Kahneman opens Part 4, Choices, by revisiting the work of Daniel Bernoulli, the 18th century mathematician who proposed one of the most enduring ideas in economics, that people make decisions based on expected utility, not raw monetary value. Bernoulli's theory introduced the concept of diminishing marginal utility, that each additional dollar brings less happiness than the one before. This elegant formula became the foundation of modern economic thought, but Kahneman reveals that it contains a crucial psychological flaw. It assumes people evaluate outcomes in absolute terms, while in reality we think in terms of gains and losses relative to a reference point. He begins by explaining Bernoulli's model. The expected utility theory says that rational agents choose between options by calculating expected utility, probability X subjective value, and selecting the one with the highest total. This explains why people are risk-averse. Losing $100 hurts more than gaining $100 feels good because utility grows more slowly as wealth increases. But Kahneman and Tversky found that real human choices systematically violate Bernoulli's predictions. People are not consistent utility maximizers. Their decisions depend heavily on context and framing, on how a problem is described, not just its mathematical structure. The same outcome can feel desirable or painful depending on the reference point from which it is judged. He illustrates this with a simple example. A person with $1 million who gains another $100,000 feels joy. A person with $5 million who loses $100,000 feels pain. In absolute terms, both end up with $1.1 million and $4.9 million. Yet their emotional experiences differ drastically. Bernoulli's theory cannot account for this because it ignores where each person started. Kahneman and Tversky's insight was that happiness and decision-making depend on changes, not states. People judge outcomes relative to their expectations, goals, and recent experiences. These reference points shift constantly with circumstances. What seemed like a gain yesterday can feel like a loss today. He calls this omission Bernoulli's error. The old model assumes utility depends only on final wealth. In reality, it depends on perceived movement from one's reference point. This is why we feel disappointment after a smaller than expected raise or satisfaction from avoiding a loss. The brain treats gains and losses asymmetrically. Losses hurt about twice as much as equivalent gains please us. This emotional asymmetry explains everyday behavior that defies rational logic. Investors hold losing stocks too long, unwilling to realize the loss. Gamblers chase losses to get back to even. Consumers feel cheated when prices rise unexpectedly, but not when they remain high. In each case, people react not to objective outcomes but to perceived losses relative to their mental baseline. Kahneman emphasizes that the reference point is psychological, not objective. It depends on expectations, recent experiences, and even how choices are framed by others. This makes human decision-making inherently unstable and susceptible to manipulation. For example, marketers can frame the same product as a gain, save 20s, or as avoiding a loss, don't waste 20s, with the latter being more persuasive because of loss aversion. He also points out that emotion, not logic, drives this asymmetry. The pain of losing triggers a stronger physiological and psychological response than the pleasure of winning. This built-in bias evolved to favor caution and survival in uncertain environments, but in modern life it leads to systematic errors in economic reasoning. Kahneman closes by explaining how Bernoulli's elegant theory inspired his own work with Tversky. They sought to create a more realistic model of choice, one that accounted for reference dependence, loss aversion, and framing effects. This model became prospect theory, which would redefine economics and psychology by showing that people are not rational calculators of utility, but storytellers of gain and loss. The key lesson of the chapter: we evaluate life not by our absolute condition, but by whether we are rising or falling relative to our expectations. Bernoulli's logic was mathematically perfect, but psychologically blind. Our minds care less about what we have than about what we feel we've gained or lost. Kahneman introduces prospect theory, the revolutionary framework he developed with Amos Tversky, to replace Bernoulli's outdated model of decision-making. While Bernoulli's expected utility theory assumes people act rationally to maximize utility, prospect theory acknowledges that human choices are systematically biased by perception, emotion, and framing. It explains how people actually behave when facing risk, uncertainty, and trade-offs between gains and losses. At its core, prospect theory rests on three psychological principles: reference dependence, loss aversion, and diminishing sensitivity. Reference dependence. People evaluate outcomes relative to a reference point, usually their current state, expectations, or recent experiences, rather than in absolute terms. Gains and losses are perceived as changes from that baseline, not as final wealth states. Loss aversion. Losses loom larger than gains. The pain of losing $100 is about twice as intense as the pleasure of winning $100. This asymmetry explains why people are risk-averse when dealing with gains, but risk-seeking when trying to avoid losses. Diminishing sensitivity. The psychological impact of gains and losses diminishes with magnitude. The difference between $100 and $200 feels greater than the difference between $1,100 and $1,200, even though both are $100 apart. Kahneman visualizes these ideas through the value function, a curve that is steep for losses and flatter for gains, and defined around the reference point, 0. This asymmetrical shape captures how humans experience outcomes: sharp pain for losses, gentle pleasure for gains, and declining sensitivity as values increase. He then explains how prospect theory accounts for real-world paradoxes that classical economics cannot. For instance, most people reject a fair coin toss where they could win $150 or lose $100, behavior that violates rational utility theory but perfectly fits loss aversion. Likewise, people prefer a sure gain of $900 over a 90% chance to win $1,000. Risk aversion in gains, yet prefer a 90% chance to lose $1,000 over a sure loss of $900. Risk-seeking in losses. These reflection effects show that people's risk preferences flip depending on whether they face gains or losses. Kahneman introduces another insight: framing effects. The way a choice is presented, whether as a gain or as avoiding a loss, dramatically alters decisions, even when outcomes are identical. For example, a treatment described as saving 90 out of 100 patients is preferred over one described as letting 10 die. System 1 reacts emotionally to framing. System 2 rarely intervenes to correct it. Prospect theory also reveals why people overweight small probabilities. Rare events like winning a lottery or dying in a plane crash feel more likely than they statistically are because they trigger vivid imagination and emotion. This explains gambling, insurance, and fear of unlikely disasters. System 1 responds to images, not numbers. Kahneman emphasizes that this overweighting applies primarily to emotional outcomes. We buy lottery tickets because we can picture winning. We buy insurance because we can imagine disaster. The mind transforms tiny probabilities into emotionally charged certainties. The theory also predicts status quo bias, the strong preference for existing conditions. Since losses hurt more than equivalent gains, any change from the current state feels risky. People resist reform, delay decisions, and cling to the familiar, not because it's rational, but because it avoids potential loss. Prospect theory, Kahneman writes, succeeded because it is both mathematically rigorous and psychologically realistic. It accounts for the asymmetry of emotion and the relativity of perception, features absent from traditional economics. It shows that people are not risk-averse or risk-seeking in general, but context-dependent, shifting behavior depending on how choices are framed around the reference point. He acknowledges that while prospect theory improved prediction, it did not eliminate irrationality. It merely described it. Human beings will always misjudge risk because the brain is wired for stories, not statistics. Still, by quantifying those errors, prospect theory transformed both economics and psychology, earning Kahneman the Nobel Prize decades later. He closes the chapter with the central lesson: we make decisions based not on objective outcomes, but on how those outcomes feel relative to where we stand. Our emotional geometry, steeper for losses, shallower for gains, shapes our financial, political, and personal choices. Prospect theory replaces the rational man of economics with the psychological human being of real life. Inconsistent, emotional, yet profoundly predictable in error. Kahneman extends prospect theory by exploring a powerful real-world consequence of loss aversion, the endowment effect, the tendency to value something more highly simply because we own it. Once an object becomes ours, giving it up feels like a loss, and since losses hurt more than equivalent gains please us, ownership inflates value. He begins with a simple experiment. Half of a group of students are given coffee mugs, the other half are not. Those with mugs are asked how much money they would accept to sell theirs. Those without are asked how much they would pay to buy one. Although the mugs are identical, the seller's minimum price is typically twice the buyer's maximum offer. Ownership transforms perception. What felt like a trivial object moments ago now feels precious once it becomes mine. This, Kahneman explains, violates classical economics, which assumes preferences are stable and independent of ownership. The endowment effect shows that preferences are constructed, not fixed. People form emotional attachments to what they possess, and losing it feels like giving up part of themselves. He connects the effect to loss aversion, one of the pillars of prospect theory. Giving up an item is experienced as a loss, while acquiring it is a gain. Because losses loom larger than gains, the pain of selling exceeds the pleasure of buying. Thus, people demand far more to part with an object than they would pay to acquire it. Kahneman shows that this phenomenon extends far beyond mugs and trinkets. Homeowners overprice their houses, investors cling to losing stocks, and collectors refuse to sell even at profitable prices. All manifestations of the same bias. Once something becomes part of our mental endowment, the prospect of parting with it triggers the emotional circuitry of loss. He also highlights how the endowment effect depends on framing. If people view a transaction as an exchange rather than a loss, the effect weakens. For example, professional traders and market makers who think in terms of trades rather than possessions show little or no endowment effect. Their training shifts the reference point from ownership to flow, turning loss into neutral transaction. Kahneman introduces the related idea of status quo bias, the strong preference for keeping things as they are. Because changes involve potential losses as well as gains, people often avoid them altogether. Even when alternatives might bring improvement, the fear of loss dominates decision-making. System 1's emotional response to potential loss overrides System 2's rational evaluation of potential gain. He gives examples from public policy and personal life. Employees resist changes to pension plans, citizens oppose tax reforms, and patients reject medical treatments that alter established routines, all driven by the same aversion to loss. The status quo feels safe not because it's objectively better, but because it avoids the discomfort of giving something up. Kahneman then explores exceptions to the endowment effect, noting that it weakens when ownership is purely symbolic or temporary. People renting or borrowing items, for example, rarely develop strong attachment. The effect also diminishes when emotions are cooled, when decisions are framed analytically rather than personally. The chapter demonstrates how the endowment effect helps explain persistent market anomalies. Consumers demand more to give up goods they already own. Investors hold losing assets too long to avoid realizing losses. Negotiators overvalue concessions they've already made. Traditional economics cannot account for these patterns because it assumes symmetry between buying and selling. Prospect theory shows that symmetry breaks at the emotional boundary of ownership. Kahneman closes with a broader reflection. Ownership changes psychology. The moment something becomes ours, it enters the domain of loss aversion. This explains why we cling to possessions, ideas, and even identities long after reason suggests we should let them go. Rationally, value should depend on utility. Psychologically, it depends on attachment. The lesson of the endowment effect is simple but profound. Our relationship to value is not objective but emotional. We don't measure worth, we feel it. And what we already have always feels worth more than what we might gain. Kahneman deepens the exploration of loss aversion by extending it beyond economics into emotion and human relationships. He argues that the same asymmetry that governs financial behavior, losses hurt more than equivalent gains please, applies equally to all aspects of life. Bad events carry more psychological weight than good ones. This principle shapes our moods, memories, and social dynamics as profoundly as it shapes our financial decisions. He begins with evidence from psychology showing that negative experiences dominate perception and memory. A single insult can outweigh several compliments. One betrayal can destroy a relationship built on years of trust. In studies of couples, researchers found that successful marriages maintain a ratio of at least 5 positive interactions for every negative one, a testament to how much more powerful bad events are. This negativity dominance reflects the same loss aversion curve described in prospect theory. The emotional impact of negative experiences is roughly twice that of equally intense positive ones. The brain evolved to prioritize threats over rewards because avoiding danger is more critical to survival than seeking pleasure. Our attention, memory, and emotions are all tuned to detect and remember losses more vividly than gains. Kahneman notes that System 1 is wired for vigilance. It reacts faster and more strongly to negative stimuli, fear, disgust, anger, than to positive ones. System 2, slower and more deliberate, can rationalize or reframe events, but it cannot erase the emotional sting left by System 1's alarm. This asymmetry explains why bad news spreads faster, why criticism lingers longer, and why fear so often overpowers hope. He illustrates how loss aversion shapes social and political life. People protest more loudly when their benefits are taken away than when new benefits are offered. Citizens resist reforms that reduce entitlements, even if the overall system improves. Governments and organizations learn that avoiding losses is more politically important than achieving gains. The result is inertia, policies that preserve the status quo out of fear of backlash. Kahneman also discusses moral and ethical implications. The asymmetry of good and bad affects how we judge actions and intentions. A single moral failure stains a reputation more deeply than many good deeds can cleanse it. Negative behavior is more diagnostic of character than positive behavior. We assume that one act of cruelty reveals more than a dozen acts of kindness. The same bias governs our sense of fairness. People are far more sensitive to perceived losses, such as pay cuts or rising prices, than to equivalent gains. A worker who receives a raise feels pleased for a short time, but one who suffers a pay reduction feels anger for much longer. This asymmetry explains why wage cuts are rare even during economic downturns. Employers prefer layoffs to reducing pay because they know losses provoke outrage while gains fade quickly. Kahneman emphasizes that the power of bad events is not merely emotional, but cognitive. Negative information receives more attention, is processed more deeply, and is remembered longer. The result is a pervasive bias toward pessimism. The world appears more dangerous and hostile than it is because bad events occupy a disproportionate share of our mental landscape. Yet, he notes, this bias is adaptive. Without it, our ancestors would have been careless in the face of threats. The problem is that in modern contexts, where physical danger is rare but psychological and social risks are constant, this ancient sensitivity leads to chronic anxiety, risk aversion, and defensive behavior. Kahneman closes by emphasizing that good and bad are not balanced forces. To achieve emotional equilibrium, positive experiences must greatly outnumber negative ones. Recognizing this can improve how we design relationships, organizations, and policies by understanding that avoiding harm matters more than creating benefit. The chapter's final insight captures the theme of human psychology at its most elemental. The power of bad events is stronger than the power of good ones. This is the emotional corollary of loss aversion, the rule that governs both our markets and our minds. Kahneman introduces one of the most important and counterintuitive insights from a prospect theory, the Fourfold Pattern of Risk attitudes. This model explains why people sometimes avoid risk and at other times embrace it, depending not on rational analysis but on how potential outcomes are framed as gains or losses, and how large or small their probabilities seem. He explains that human attitudes toward risk are governed by the interaction of two psychological forces. Loss aversion, losses hurt more than equivalent gains, please. Probability weighting, people overweight small probabilities and underweight moderate or high ones. When these forces combine, they create 4 distinct psychological zones of decision-making. High probability of gain, underweighting of near certainty, risk-averse, preferring a sure gain of $900 to a 95% chance of $1,000. High probability of loss, underweighting of near certainty, Risk-seeking, choosing a 95% chance to lose $1,000 over a sure loss of $900. Low probability of gain, overweighting of small chance, risk-seeking, buying lottery tickets, low probability of loss, overweighting of small chance, risk-averse, buying insurance. Kahneman describes this as a fourfold pattern of preferences, a psychological map showing how humans actually respond to risk rather than how they should respond according to classical economics. He begins with high probability gains, where people are typically risk-averse. When the chance of winning is almost certain, we prefer the guaranteed outcome, even if the risky option has a higher expected value. The certainty of gain feels emotionally safe, so we sacrifice a little potential profit to eliminate uncertainty. In contrast with high probability losses, people often become risk-seeking. Faced with a near-certain loss, they gamble for a chance to avoid it, even when doing so worsens the expected outcome. This explains why individuals in financial trouble double down on bad investments, or why governments escalate failing wars. The pain of admitting loss outweighs rational calculation. When probabilities are very low, the pattern reverses. For small chances of gain, like winning a lottery, people are risk-seeking because tiny probabilities are overweighted emotionally. We imagine the reward vividly, and the small chance feels larger than it is. Conversely, with small chances of loss, such as accidents, disease, or theft, people are risk-averse. They buy insurance and safety devices to avoid unlikely harm, treating small risks as intolerable. Kahneman emphasizes that these tendencies are not errors but features of how the human mind works. System 1 responds to emotion, not statistics. Gains produce satisfaction, losses evoke fear, and probabilities are distorted by imagination. System 2 could correct these distortions but rarely does, because the intuitive feelings of risk are so compelling. He also explores how framing interacts with the fourfold pattern. The same situation can elicit opposite behaviors depending on whether it is described as a gain or a loss. A surgeon who says 90% survive inspires confidence. One who says 10% die provokes fear, even though the statistics are identical. System 1 reacts to the emotional tone of the frame, not its logical content. Kahneman warns that the fourfold pattern can lead to systematic inconsistencies in decision-making. People may buy both lottery tickets and insurance, seeking risk in one context and avoiding it in another, because each appeals to a different emotional bias. He summarizes the key insight. Risk preferences are not stable traits but situational responses. We are not inherently risk-averse or risk-seeking. We switch modes depending on whether we face gains or losses and on the probability involved. Finally, Kahneman connects this pattern to broader human behavior. It explains gambling, speculation, insurance, and even political choices. People are drawn to long-shot hopes and terrified of rare dangers. They cling to failing causes but cash out early from winning ones. The chapter concludes with a concise principle that unites the psychology of risk. We are risk-averse in gains and risk-seeking in losses, but only when probabilities are high. When probabilities are low, the pattern reverses. This fourfold map of the mind captures the paradoxical, emotional, and deeply human nature of decision-making under uncertainty. Kahneman expands on the previous chapter by examining how people misperceive rare events, those with very low probability but strong emotional impact. Humans, he explains, are not built to think statistically. Instead, we respond to the vividness of outcomes, not their mathematical likelihood. System 1, which governs intuition, treats dramatic possibilities as if they were far more probable than they truly are. He begins by noting that people overweight small probabilities, a cornerstone of prospect theory. When an unlikely event carries strong emotional charge, like a lottery win, terrorist attack, or deadly disease, the mind magnifies its significance. We picture the event vividly, feel its emotional consequences, and this feeling becomes a substitute for probability. As a result, the difference between a 0.001% chance and a 1% chance feels far greater than it mathematically is. This effect explains two opposite but related behaviors: buying insurance and buying lottery tickets. In both cases, people pay a premium for emotion. Insurance buyers pay to eliminate small chances of loss, while gamblers pay to experience the dream of a huge gain. The logic is irrational but consistent. System 1 reacts to feelings, not to numbers. Kahneman distinguishes between experienced probabilities and remembered or imagined probabilities. In daily life, we base our beliefs on what we've seen or can easily recall. But rare events, by definition, occur infrequently, so our direct experience of them is limited. Instead, we rely on stories, media, and imagination, which amplify certain risks and erase others. This produces a distorted perception of the world. Some dangers, like plane crashes, seem constant, while more common ones, like car accidents or chronic illness, are underestimated. He emphasizes that the emotional vividness of an event determines how it is weighted. A shark attack, though extremely rare, evokes powerful fear because it's easy to imagine. A fatal fall in the bathroom, though far more common, evokes none. The availability heuristic magnifies the salience of dramatic imagery, turning the improbable into the emotionally certain. Kahneman then explores how personal experience and feedback modify perception. When people have direct experience with rare events, such as living through a natural disaster, they tend to overestimate the risk immediately afterward, but this effect fades quickly as emotion cools. When the event remains only hypothetical, its imagined power can persist indefinitely, leading to chronic overestimation. Thus, rare events are simultaneously overweighted in theory and underweighted in practice. He gives examples. After terrorist attacks, people avoid flying for months, even though air travel remains safer than driving. Smokers underestimate the risk of cancer because it is distant and impersonal, while fearing far less likely but more salient dangers. Investors panic over unlikely market crashes but ignore slow, cumulative risks like inflation or bad strategy. Kahneman also notes that framing strongly influences the perception of rare events. People respond differently when a 1% chance of death is described as 1 in 100 will die versus 99 in 100 will survive. The latter feels safer because it evokes a dominant image of survival rather than death. System 1 processes such frames emotionally, not logically. He distinguishes between possibility and certainty. People treat the difference between 0% and 1% as enormous, transforming an impossible event into a possible one, but barely register the difference between 41% and 42%. In psychological terms, possibility and certainty anchor emotion. Intermediate probabilities barely move it. This is why even negligible risks, like vaccine side effects or rare crimes, can dominate headlines and public fear. Kahneman also observes that rare events attract disproportionate attention in politics and media. Journalists and policymakers exploit emotional salience by emphasizing improbable dangers. This leads to irrational policies. Governments overspend on visible but rare threats while neglecting common, invisible ones. The public's perception of danger is thus shaped less by data than by drama. He concludes by highlighting the tension between intuition and rationality. The human mind evolved to react to vivid dangers, not to interpret statistics. System 1 is easily captured by images of disaster or fortune. System 2, which could correct these distortions, is lazy and often silent. The practical lesson, Kahneman writes, is to recognize when rare events are dominating your thinking. Ask whether the fear or hope you feel matches the actual odds. In most cases, it doesn't. He ends the chapter with a simple truth about human psychology. We respond to the possibility of loss or gain, not to its probability. Rare events, though statistically negligible, shape our decisions because they loom large in imagination. And in the emotional theater of the mind, imagination always wins over mathematics. Kahneman shifts from describing how people misperceive risk to explaining how they can manage risk more rationally through consistent rules or policies that protect against momentary emotion and bias. Because individual decisions are often distorted by framing, mood, and short-term context, he argues that the only way to think clearly under uncertainty is to adopt general principles that apply across situations, what he calls broad framing. He begins with an observation. When people face isolated decisions, they tend to narrowly frame them, focusing on immediate outcomes rather than on the long-term pattern of similar choices. Narrow framing magnifies loss aversion and emotional noise. For instance, an investor who evaluates each stock movement separately will experience fear after every small loss and joy after every small gain, leading to erratic behavior. But if that same investor views all investments as one portfolio, a broad frame, the emotional impact of any single loss is diluted, and decisions become more stable. Kahneman distinguishes between two modes of decision-making: narrow framing, evaluating choices one by one, exaggerating the emotional weight of small risks; broad framing, seeing choices as part of a larger pattern or long-term plan, reducing sensitivity to individual outcomes. Broad framing allows for the creation of risk policies, consistent rules that guide behavior regardless of temporary emotion. Examples include always buying insurance for major losses but never for minor ones, never selling stocks during a panic, always choosing the same deductible level for similar risks. These rules prevent System 1's fear and short-term fluctuations from hijacking decision-making. Kahneman illustrates this with a simple scenario. Imagine an employer offering two independent bets to an employee, each with a 50% chance to win or lose $500. Most people reject both bets when considered individually. They dislike the risk of a loss. Yet, when both bets are viewed together, a broad frame, the probability of losing overall becomes small, and the expected value turns positive. The rational policy would be to accept both bets. This shows that risk aversion is largely a product of narrow framing. He explains that human psychology is not naturally equipped for broad framing, because System 1 experiences every loss as immediate and personal, while System 2 must work hard to see patterns. The emotional sting of a single loss can outweigh several gains, even when logic says otherwise. That's why gamblers quit after losing streaks and why investors panic during downturns. Kahneman argues that organizations are better at broad framing than individuals, since institutions can formalize policies and enforce consistency. For example, insurance companies use statistical models to determine risk levels and premiums, rather than emotional reactions to recent claims. Similarly, well-managed investment funds set clear asset allocation rules and avoid acting on market noise. He advises individuals to mimic this institutional discipline by adopting personal policies, pre-committed rules that eliminate case-by-case decision-making. A personal risk policy might include always contributing to a retirement plan, maintaining an emergency fund, or avoiding high-interest debt. Once such policies are set, emotion plays a smaller role. Kahneman also discusses mental accounting, the tendency to divide money into separate psychological accounts, savings, entertainment, investments, rather than treating all money as interchangeable. While this can be useful for budgeting, it also encourages narrow framing and inconsistent risk behavior. For example, someone may gamble with found money while being overly cautious with savings, even though both have the same value. Broad framing corrects this by viewing all resources as part of a single system. He introduces the idea of a long-term self, a rational observer who watches over the emotional, short-term self. The long-term self benefits from broad framing, while the short-term self is ruled by loss aversion. The goal of good decision-making is to align momentary choices with long-term interests through stable policies. Kahneman's practical takeaway is clear. Avoid evaluating decisions in isolation. Think in terms of categories, portfolios, and policies. Let rules replace feelings in the face of risk. He concludes that rational decision-making requires structure, not strength of will. You cannot eliminate emotional bias by trying harder. You can only design systems that prevent it from dominating. The final message of the chapter captures Kahneman's pragmatic philosophy. You make better decisions by losing less sleep over any single one. Broad framing and well-designed risk policies turn chance into strategy, allowing reason rather than emotion to govern the uncertain future. Kahneman explores how people mentally track their gains and losses through what he calls mental accounting, a psychological system for keeping score. While economists assume that money is fungible and that people evaluate it rationally, humans actually divide wealth into separate mental categories: savings, income, bonuses, gambling money, and treat each account differently. This segmentation profoundly distorts financial and everyday decisions, revealing how emotions and framing dominate over logic. He begins with the example of a theatergoer who loses a $10 bill on the way to buy a ticket, and another who buys a ticket and then loses it before entering. Both are $10 poorer, yet most people will replace the lost bill but not the lost ticket. The reason lies in mental accounting. The first loss is coded as general money, while the second is charged against the entertainment account, which now feels overspent. Although the financial situation is identical, the psychological framing produces different behavior. Kahneman explains that we all maintain mental ledgers for different aspects of life: work, leisure, investment, family, each with its own rules of fairness, responsibility, and emotion. We dislike losses within any one account, even when an equivalent gain exists elsewhere. This narrow balancing is another manifestation of loss aversion, where each mental compartment resists acknowledging broader trade-offs. People will avoid selling a losing stock to realize a gain elsewhere because that would lock in a loss within one specific mental category. He shows how mental accounting leads to systematic irrationalities. A person may splurge on an expensive dinner after winning a small bet, feeling entitled to a reward from that mental windfall, even while struggling with unpaid bills. Similarly, investors may separate risky and safe money, treating the risky account as play money, though the same loss affects their total wealth. These distortions stem from a deep need for emotional order. We want our personal ledgers to feel balanced, even if the overall logic fails. Kahneman connects this tendency to framing and reference points. Each mental account is defined relative to expectations. A bonus feels like a gain only when it exceeds what we anticipated. If smaller than expected, it feels like a loss even though it increases wealth. This explains why satisfaction often depends more on framing than on actual financial condition. We react not to reality but to perceived movement within each mental category. He notes that organizations too fall prey to the same psychology. Departments guard their budgets jealously, refusing to sacrifice a small advantage for the company's greater good. Executives judge projects within narrow financial silos rather than seeing the total picture. The human need to keep score locally undermines rational strategy globally. Kahneman describes how mental accounting affects everyday risk-taking. Gamblers separate wins and losses instead of viewing their long-term net result. After a win, they play more aggressively, feeling they are playing with the house's money. After a loss, they chase the deficit to get even. Both patterns are fueled by the illusion that each session is its own self-contained account. Investors behave the same way, taking unnecessary risks after profits and irrationally clinging to failing positions after losses. He links this behavior to the earlier concept of narrow framing. By focusing on individual episodes rather than the cumulative outcome, people amplify emotion and inconsistency. Broad framing, seeing all decisions as part of one continuous account, would reduce emotional volatility and improve reasoning, but it is unnatural to System 1. The intuitive mind prefers stories and compartments. The analytical mind struggles to unify them. Kahneman also explores how emotions of regret and pride shape the mental balance sheet. We credit ourselves for gains that confirm our competence but attribute losses to bad luck. The scorekeeping process is not neutral. It protects self-esteem by rewriting the emotional ledger. Memory, he suggests, serves not as a record of events but as a system for maintaining psychological equilibrium. He concludes that while mental accounting is irrational in economic terms, it serves a purpose in daily life. It helps people manage complexity, control spending, and impose moral order on choices. Yet it also traps them in short-term thinking and inconsistent risk behavior. The art of good decision-making lies in recognizing when mental accounts distort judgment, when the feeling of balance diverges from actual well-being. The final insight of the chapter is both psychological and philosophical. We live by stories of gain and loss, not by arithmetic. Our internal bookkeeping, though biased, gives meaning to success and failure. But the wise person learns when to close the books, merge the accounts, and see life's ledger as a whole. Kahneman explores one of the most striking implications of prospect theory. preference reversals, the phenomenon where people's choices change depending on how options are framed, even when the underlying facts remain identical. These reversals reveal that human preferences are not stable or internally consistent. They shift with wording, context, and emotional focus. Rational theory assumes that if someone prefers A to B, they will always prefer A to B. But in reality, human judgment violates this rule regularly and predictably. He begins by describing experiments in which participants were asked to choose between two bets, one with a high probability of winning a modest amount, and another with a small probability of winning a large amount. When asked to choose, most selected the safer bet. However, when asked to assign prices to the same bets, how much they would sell each for, the pattern reversed. People valued the riskier bet higher, even though they had just rejected it. This inconsistency is not random but follows the emotional principles of prospect theory. Kahneman explains that when choosing, people focus on the probability of winning and tend to avoid risk. When pricing, they focus on the potential payoff and are drawn to the magnitude of the prize. System 1 reacts to whatever aspect of the problem feels most salient at the moment. As attention shifts, so do preferences. There is no single stable, true preference hidden beneath the surface, only context-dependent emotions masquerading as reason. This dynamic also appears outside laboratory experiments. Consumers, investors, and voters routinely reverse their preferences depending on how information is presented. A car advertised as 90% reliable seems more appealing than one described as 10% failure rate. Investors who reject a risky stock may still demand a high price to sell it once they own it, revealing that ownership and framing change valuation. Kahneman links preference reversals to the framing effect, one of the central findings of behavioral economics. The same outcome can elicit opposite choices depending on whether it is presented as a gain or a loss. He recounts the famous Asian disease problem, in which people must choose between two programs to combat a deadly epidemic. When outcomes are framed in terms of lives saved, most choose the sure option. When framed in terms of lives lost, most prefer the gamble. The two frames are mathematically identical, yet evoke entirely different emotional responses. This reversal occurs because System 1 responds to emotional tone, not logical equivalence. The word saved activates hope and security. The word lost evokes fear. System 2 could reconcile the contradiction but rarely intervenes. Thus, preferences are constructed on the spot, reflecting transient feelings rather than stable values. Kahneman argues that preference reversals expose a deeper flaw in the economic model of the rational agent. If preferences can flip with mere wording, then there is no coherent internal scale of value guiding decisions. Instead, preferences are context-sensitive expressions of emotion, imagination, and attention. The illusion of rational consistency is maintained only because most of us never see our contradictions side by side. He also discusses policy implications. Because framing so powerfully shapes public choices, governments and marketers can manipulate behavior simply by rephrasing outcomes. Presenting retirement savings as keeping more of your income for later, rather than reducing your current spending, dramatically increases participation rates. The same principle underlies nudging, the behavioral strategy of structuring choices to encourage beneficial outcomes without restricting freedom. Yet Kahneman does not celebrate this manipulability. He sees it as a warning. The ease with which preferences can be reversed demonstrates that rational autonomy is fragile. Our moral and political decisions, like our economic ones, depend on the framing of consequences, on which emotions are triggered by words, numbers, or imagery. He notes that experts are not immune. Doctors frame diagnoses in ways that sway patients' choices. Judges, negotiators, and investors unconsciously use language that biases outcomes. Even scientists fall victim to framing when interpreting data, favoring conclusions that match the tone of their expectations. Kahneman concludes that the existence of reversals proves there is no single stable utility function governing human behavior. The mind constructs its values in real time, guided by context, emotion, and memory. This does not make reasoning impossible, but it demands vigilance. The final insight of the chapter is unsettling yet liberating. What we want depends on how we think about it, and how we think about it depends on how it is presented. Rational choice, once believed to rest on fixed preferences, turns out to rest on fluid perception. Awareness of this fact does not eliminate bias, but it allows us to question the stories that shape our desires before they silently reverse them. Kahneman concludes by showing how framing shapes perception itself, not just preference. A frame is the mental structure that defines how a situation is interpreted, what counts as a gain, a loss, a risk, or an opportunity. The frame determines the story we tell ourselves, and that story becomes our reality. Rational analysis assumes people see facts objectively and then evaluate them. In truth, we interpret facts through the frame, and the frame dictates emotion, memory, and choice before reason even enters the process. He begins with a simple truth. There is no neutral way to describe a decision. Every formulation emphasizes some aspects and hides others. Saying that a treatment saves 90% of patients evokes optimism. Saying it kills 10% evokes fear. The statistics are identical, but the emotions are not. The brain reacts not to the abstract number, but to the image and feeling the words evoke. System 1 interprets language automatically, drawing emotional meaning before System 2 can compute equivalence. Kahneman points out that people do not choose their frames consciously. They inherit them from context, culture, and conversation. A consumer frame is different from a citizen frame. A short-term investor's frame differs from a pensioner's. Most of our judgments are anchored in the first plausible frame that appears, and we rarely question its boundaries. This makes framing one of the most subtle and powerful forms of influence, because whoever defines the frame defines the meaning. He gives examples from everyday life and politics. A tax cut framed as returning money to taxpayers feels generous and fair. The same policy framed as defunding public services feels harmful. In marketing, the phrase 90% fat-free sells better than contains 10% fat. In public health, people support preventive programs when outcomes are described as lives saved, but resist when framed as deaths prevented. These reactions are not mistakes in calculation. They are emotional responses to different mental pictures of the same reality. Kahneman connects framing to the earlier concept of reference dependence. The reference point acts as a psychological frame for evaluating outcomes. What feels like a gain or a loss depends on where the frame is placed. For instance, a salary of $60,000 may feel high in one social context and low in another. Expectations define happiness more than absolute income. Similarly, a company reporting a smaller than expected loss is rewarded, while one showing a modest profit below forecast is punished. The frame determines interpretation, not the data itself. He argues that frames operate not only in communication, but also in internal thought. When people recall past events or imagine the future, they select which details to highlight, and that selection changes the emotional meaning of the story. We can reframe our own experiences to feel gratitude instead of resentment, pride instead of regret, depending on which reference points we emphasize. This insight underlies cognitive therapy. By changing the mental frame, one changes emotional reality. Kahneman also warns that framing has moral and political consequences. Public debates often masquerade as disagreements about facts but are actually battles over frames. A war on terror implies one kind of moral duty. Police action abroad another. Frames justify policies before arguments begin. Rational deliberation becomes impossible when opposing sides live within incompatible frames of meaning. He returns to his long-standing theme. System 1 is fast, automatic, and story-driven. It accepts the frame as given. System 2, capable of reframing, is slow, effortful, and often lazy. Most people live within the default frames supplied by others, media, institutions, advertisers, without realizing how much those frames define what seems real. To think clearly requires framing the frame, stepping outside it to see how it shapes judgment. This mental move demands awareness and humility, recognizing that our view of the world is not the world itself, but a version colored by language and expectation. Kahneman closes with an image of the mind as a perpetual storyteller, constructing reality one frame at a time. Facts alone are inert. They acquire meaning only within a narrative. The discipline of rational thought lies in questioning those narratives, asking whose frame we are using and what it makes us feel. The final insight is both practical and philosophical. Reality, for the human mind, is never raw. It is always framed. Understanding this does not free us from bias, but it gives us the power to recognize when our certainty is only the echo of the story we have chosen to believe. Thank you for watching until the end. If you want to go deep down into the rabbit hole of marketing and persuasion, click the link in the description where you will find many fundamental books about copywriting, psychology, and persuasion. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. See you in the next one.